Hi Julian, so here is the recording of the office mix on integrating quoted evidence into writing. So before you start, you're going to want to pick up a copy of They Say I Say. We're going to be referencing elements of chapter 3. Alright, so the first, I guess in this office mix we're going through a number of tips that can help you properly integrate quoted evidence into writing. So the first tip that I have is to make sure that you frame every quotation. So what you don't want to have are dangling or hit-and-run sentences, or quotations, I mean. So these types of quotations are standalone sentences. So they're not integrated into a sentence that you've already started, and they don't include any explanation. So you just hope that your readers understand why you've quoted this in the first place. So instead, what you want to do is provide a frame for your quotations, and I like to call this a quote sandwich. So there's two parts to the frame. The first part is the lead-in. And in the lead-in to your quote, you should do two things. You should first identify the speaker, and then also provide context for the quote. So you will establish or begin to introduce the idea that's going to be discussed in the quote. If you're quoting something from literature, you might establish the time and place within the plot that this particular moment is occurring. Then you'll have the quote, which is integrated within the lead-in, and you'll end with a follow-up. So the follow-up is basically your commentary on the quoted evidence. So this is where you interpret the evidence and illustrate its significance to the point you're trying to make. So if you open up your book and you turn to pages 46 and 47, you'll find some templates that help you introduce or lead into the quotation and then explain or follow up the quotation. So just take a minute to turn to these pages and look through these templates. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to look through those templates, take a minute to read through this example of a well-integrated quote and see if you can identify the different elements of the lead-in, so where you establish the speaker and the context, and then also the follow-up, where you would interpret the quote and illustrate its significance to the point being made. Okay, so here we see the same quote with all of the pieces labeled. So the very first sentence we would imagine would maybe be the topic sentence of this paragraph that establishes the idea that there are many feminist philosophers that deplore Western media's obsession with female fitness and dieting. So now we're going to go into our quoted textual evidence. So Susan Bordeaux is our speaker. Alright, so we're establishing the speaker. And then the orange part that follows is the context. So we introduce her basic complaint about dieting, and we also then have this additional piece of context that is a part of the direct lead-in into the quote. So notice how the quote is actually a part of a sentence that we've already started. So this beginning of the sentence, citing the islands of Fiji as a case in point, helps to establish the exact context of this quote. We're talking about Fiji. And then again, we remind our reader of the speaker, and then we go right into our quote. So notice how we have the page number, the in-text citation, we have the quotation marks around what we're quoting, and then the period goes outside of the parenthetical documentation. Then we follow up to interpret and explain the significance of this piece of quoted evidence. So the green part is the interpretation. This is where the author of this particular essay basically puts Bordeaux's opinion in his or her own words. And then the blue part helps to establish the connection between the quoted evidence and the point that they're trying to establish, that many female philosophers are upset about Western media's obsession with female fitness and dieting, specifically because of the impact that it has on cultures around the world. Okay, so tip 2. When quoting textual evidence is to pay attention to your diction, and specifically the way that you word the lead-ins to the quotes and also the follow-up. So at no point do you want to say that the text or the quote is saying something, right? Texts are not living things, so they don't speak. Same thing with quotes. Instead, it's the author or the narrator, or maybe in the case of literature, a character is saying something. So what I have circled here are examples of what not to do. So you want to avoid these types of lead-ins. Instead, if you were to look back at our example previously, we have Bordeaux notes. Alright, so this is our speaker, and she is noting something. It's not the quote that's saying something. It's not the text that's saying something. It's the actual person responsible for these ideas. The other thing you want to do is use words other than just says when introducing a quote. So Bordeaux, or in the previous example again, was in Bordeaux notes. Here's some other examples of words that you could use, verbs that help to more precisely describe the nature of the message behind the quote that you are using. Also, you don't at any point really want to include paragraph numbers when you are citing information. You're going to cite the page number parenthetically if there is in fact a page number. So you don't want to say like in paragraph 5 so and so states. You just don't want to do that. And then finally, you're going to write in present tense. So the author argues rather than the author argued. The reason for this is that text, like any kind of text, is considered almost like a living thing because it's always existing. So it is always communicating the point that it's communicating. It might sound kind of weird, but that's the rationale behind it, I guess. Okay, so the final tip is to quote only what you need. So sometimes we're tempted to quote a bunch of stuff when in fact we are really only talking about a small portion of it. So there's two things that you can do to quote only what you need. One, you can use an ellipses, so this is the ... to eliminate irrelevant parts of longer passages. So you would just delete the part that you're not talking about and replace it with the ellipses. The other thing that you can do is just always have the mindset of quoting only what you can analyze or what is revealing. So sometimes you might be quoting something as short as a word or even a phrase, and if that's all that you need in order to make your point, then you don't need to feel tempted to quote more than what's necessary. Alright, so at this point you're going to want to go back to the Office Mix, click on the Table of Contents button, and then go directly to slide 7 so you can respond to this question. So look back at your integrated textual evidence post. So this will be on Google Classroom. If you click the box that has all the topics in it, if you click Formative Assignment, this will be, I think, maybe the 4th post that's there. Look back at the integrated textual evidence that you posted and evaluate your work. So based on what we've talked about here about integrating textual evidence properly, what do you feel that you've done well, and then what do you feel you can do to improve?